Along with the skin itself, there are several important derivatives of the epidermis, and we call these the skin appendages. And some of these skin appendages are going to include things like hair, the hair follicle, the nails, which is going to contain epithelial cells. There is the sweat and also the oil glands. So each of these is going to play an important role in the functioning of the skin. And so a key important step in forming any of these appendages is the formation of what's called an epithelial bud. And we're going to talk about these next, starting with the important skin appendage, which is the hair. And functions of the hair would be alerting the body to insects on the skin. So if you think about a mosquito landing on your skin, other examples would be guarding the scalp against physical trauma, heat loss, or sunlight. Now, all hair is actually consisting of dead keratinized cells. And remember, the keratin is this fibrous protein that gives the epithelial cells the characteristic of being very, very tough. So these are heavily keratinized epithelial cells. Hair is found everywhere in the body except for the palms, the lips, the nipples, or the external genitalia, like the head of the penis, for example. And other functions of the skin would be that of the eyelashes, so shielding the eyes from sunlight, the filtering that happens, so for protection. So if we think about the hairs that are inside of our nose, filtering out large particles. And the color of hair is obviously going to vary quite a bit, but what's interesting is that the hair is going to vary based on the levels of the melanin. And what happens as we age is there's a decreased amount of melanin, and there's also air bubbles that are found in the hair shaft. And this is going to lead to the gray or the white color that is oftentimes seen in the hair. Now, the chief regions of the structure of the hair, and the word hair, the scientific term for this is pilus, so singular, and then pili for plural, and it's the flexible strand that's actually produced by the hair follicle themselves. And again, it's dead keratinized cells. So this is what makes the hair very tough and durable. And the individual cells themselves do not flake off. Now, the main regions of the hair are the hair shaft, and this is the region of the hair where the keratinization is complete. So where there is an abundance of the keratin that has been produced. So the keratinization is complete in the hair shaft. The root is where keratinization is still ongoing. So ongoing keratinization. And the shaft itself, which is actually what's going to project out of the skin, as you can see right here, is embedded in the skin. And the root is really the remainder of the hair deep within the follicle. So we can see the hair root shown on this diagram. And the hair has three concentric regions, concentric layers of keratinized cells that you should be aware of. The very center is called the medulla. Then there is the cortex, which is a bulky layer that's surrounding the medulla, several layers of flattened cells. And that's what you see in this area right here, which is surrounding the medulla itself. And then outside of that is the cuticle. That's the outermost portion. Forms a single layer of overlapping cells, kind of like the shingles on a roof. And this is the most heavily keratinized part of the hair. So it's the strongest part of the hair, and it's subjected to the most forces, so it can wear away at the tip of the hair shaft and lead to split ends, which a lot of us are familiar with. And hair pigment is obviously several colors. due to the melanin. So it could be responsible for the colors yellow, rust, brown, etc. And again, the gray and the white can occur because of air bubbles that replace the melanin. Well, what's interesting, it can be controlled by some delayed action genes which don't start until later in life. And one interesting fact is that there is actually a chemical called trichocitrin, which is an iron-containing chemical, and that's responsible for red hair. So the hair follicles themselves now, the hair follicles are going to be deep down from the epidermal surface, and they actually go into the dermis. So what we're looking here on this slide is the area that you see in the box to the right, and the deep end of the hair follicle expands to form the hair bulb, and so that's the area in the very center region that you see right here, the hair bulb. And the hair bulb is going to be surrounded by hair follicle receptors, which is the hair root plexus, and the word plexus is referring to a group of nerves that surround the hair bulb in this case. And so this would be responsible for the nerve sensation that you feel if somebody were to pull on your hair. And the very center of this is called the hair papilla. The papilla is a little bit of dermal tissue that is going to protrude up into the hair bulb. And this is an important area because it's going to contain a knot of capillaries that are going to supply nutrients to the growing hair as it continues to grow. And it's kind of similar to the dermal papillae that are underlying the epidermal regions, which we would see in other parts of the skin. Now the wall of the hair follicle itself is composed of an outer peripheral connective tissue sheath. And this is shown on this slide. This is the connective tissue root sheath. And this is going to be derived from the basement basal lamina area. And it's going to surround the hair follicle itself. So it's sort of this area that would be found right in here, surrounding the hair follicle. And then there is an epithelial root sheath, which is going to be closer to the hair root itself. Now the cells that make up the hair matrix are going to be the ones that are actively dividing. So you can kind of think of them as being analogous to the stratum basal. And so they're constantly going to be dividing in the hair matrix. And you can see the hair matrix is pointing to the very, very center right here. And then as the cells continue to divide, they're going to be pushing in an upward direction, and as that process happens, they continue to keratinize more and more and continually die as they move out towards the hair shaft. So the outermost portion, the cuticle, is going to be the dead cells where all the keratinization is going to be complete. And then in the cortex, they are a little younger, keratinization is undergoing, and then they're just dividing in the cortex area. Or I'm sorry, in the medulla area. One of the important parts of the hair that you should be aware of is the erector pili muscle. And erector means that the pilus is going to be standing straight up. So the term piloerection or piloerection is referring to the hair standing up. And this is exactly what's going to happen with the erector pili muscle. So the erector pili muscle is commonly thought of as our goosebump muscle. It's the muscle that is going to automatically stand up if we're frightened. So it's commonly called the hair-raising muscle. It's also going to stand up if we get cold. And we remember this much more quickly when we think about a cat. As soon as a cat gets scared, its hair is going to stand straight up because of its erector pili muscles. Now the different types of hair that we have in our body, the body hair of children and adult females, for example, is pale fine hair, and this is coarse or long hair of the eyebrow. So it would be there's a couple different types of hair that you should be aware of. There is what's called vellus hair, and this is the body hair that's found in children and adult females. There's also a more coarse long hair, which is found on the eyebrows, the scalp, in the armpit, and the pubic area. So these are the two different ones you need to be aware of. And the terminal hairs, they're going to grow in response specifically to certain types of hormones, which are called androgens. And classically, these are thought of as the male sex hormones, testosterone being one of the most significant of them. And so when these male hormones kick in during growth, the terminal hair growth is quite extensive. Now, hair growth can be affected by different factors. Some of those are things like nutrition and hormones that can affect them. Also, blood flow that's going to the hair follicle itself can also affect growth. Now, some of the homeostatic imbalances that can result here are things like hirsutism and hirsutism would be excessive hairiness. And in this case, this could be due to signs of over-masculinization, so excessive hairiness. And it could be due to an adrenal gland or an ovarian tumor. So there would be excessive amounts of androgens that could lead to this situation. The other examples are things like baldness. Alopecia is hair thinning that automatically happens as we age. Hair grows fastest from the teen years to about the 40s, but after that there's some degree of baldness, and this degree of baldness is called alopecia. Now, true baldness, which is also called frank baldness, so true or frank baldness is a genetically determined situation, and in this case, male pattern baldness, it can occur when there is a gene that is triggered in adulthood, and this gene can cause a change in the response of the hair follicles to DHT. And DHT is an example of an androgen. It stands for dihydrotestosterone. And it's a metabolite of testosterone, so it's related to testosterone. So as an example, it actually affects the follicular growth cycle. So these would be the growth cycles of the follicle itself. So there is less cycles that actually occur in men that have male pattern baldness. Nails are another appendage that you should be aware of the skin. And a nail is really a scaled modification of the epidermis. So it's made up of heavily keratinized epithelial cells. The deeper layers of the epidermis are actually going to extend beneath the nail, and you can see them on this diagram. They're going to form what is called the nail bed, this area labeled here, and the nail bed is going to correspond to the superficial keratinized layers, but the thickened proximal portion of the nail bed is called the nail matrix, and it's responsible for nail growth. So as the nail cells produced by the matrix become more and more keratinized, the nail is going to slide in a more distal direction to develop into the nail bed. Now, nails are normally pink in color because of the capillaries. You can see some examples of capillaries that are located that are directly deep to the nail bed. So they're going to be responsible for the color of the nail themselves. But the region that lies right over the matrix is usually going to be called, it's usually going to be a white crescent shape, and it's called a lanule. And the word lanule, you can see it kind of looks like a half moon or a crescent shape here. And that's where the word comes from. It kind of looks like, it means little moon. And the proximal and the lateral borders of the nail are overlapped by skin folds. And you can see the skin fold shown here. There's a lateral nail fold that's shown here. And the proximal nail fold itself is called the cuticle or the opuntium. And the changes in the nail are going to change over time. A yellow tinged nail could be responsible for possibly a thyroid gland disorder, or thickened yellow nails could result from possibly a fungus infection. So the color of the nails could be very important diagnostic tools. The next appendage would be the sweat glands, and these sweat glands are called sudoriferous glands. So it's very important that you can differentiate sudoriferous glands from sebaceous glands. And these are going to be the glands that are most important in thermoregulation. So very important for allowing water to be released from our body so that we can cool, and also the opposite, but mostly cooling. We have two major types of sweat glands, sudoriferous glands. The major type would be the eccrine glands, and there is about 3 million of these per person, so a huge amount of eccrine sweat glands. Now these eccrine sweat glands are going to secrete the sweat via the merocrine mechanism, which you learned about in chapter 4. Again, these are the most numerous, and they're going to be found particularly on the palms, the soles, and the forehead. And you've all experienced this on a very hot day. There's sweat that's running down your forehead, and you're just dripping with sweat on a really hot day, which happens quite a bit here in Florida. So each of these are going to be simple, they're going to be coiled, and they're going to be tubular in structure. So physiologically they are merocrine, but anatomically they are simple, coiled, and tubular. And you'll notice this on the models that you're going to be learning in lab, so for your next practical. The production from these glands is sweat, which is primarily hypotonic. It's actually a hypotonic solution that is a filtrate from the blood. So there is water that is going to be removed from the blood, and that would be what's containing the sodium chloride. So it's going to contain predominantly sodium chloride, but it could also have vitamin C in it, has antibodies, different metabolic wastes. And this is one thing that could actually vary based on diet. Normally this sweat is going to be very acidic, so it's going to have a pH of 4 to 6, and it can help to contribute to the acid mantle, which helps to protect us. It is predominantly controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, so the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. So again, it prevents the body from overheating. So again, it helps the body to cool off, kind of like a radiator would for a car. It's also induced, when we're scared. So a cold sweat is brought on by the sympathetic or fight or flight nervous system. The second type of gland, second type of sudoriferous gland, is called the apocrine gland. And we have much fewer of these. We only have about 2,000 or so. And they're going to be in the armpit, which is the axillary, you'll recall from chapter 1, and the genital areas. And in spite of their name, they actually are a type of merocrine gland, so just like the eccrine sweat glands. And they're going to release their product by exocytosis, so just like the eccrine sweat glands. They're going to be much larger, so that's one way that you can identify them on the diagrams or the models. And they're going to be deeper in the dermis, and sometimes even found in the hypodermis. But one of the main differences is that they're going to be in the real smelly areas. So they're going to have fatty substances that are part of their secretion as well as different proteins. So this helps to actually make the sweat more viscous and sometimes milky or actually yellowish in color. The sweat is actually going to be odorless, but that's just until the time where the bacteria are going to start to decode, or start to not decode but decompose these organic molecules like the proteins and the fatty acids. The apocrine glands are going to be affected by things like androgens, male sex hormones. Also, they're going to be increased during sexual foreplay. Now, two other types of sudoriferous glands are the ceruminous glands, and ceruminous is going to release cerumen, which is earwax, and also the mammary glands are going to secrete milk, and you're not going to talk much about them until Anatomy and Physiology 2. This slide here is showing examples of cutaneous glands, and on the picture to the left we see a sebaceous gland, which is an oil gland. And notice where the oil gland is located. They're always going to be surrounding a hair follicle. So they're going to be at least associated with the hair follicle. And then the eccrine gland is the sweat gland. And notice how its structure is quite distinct. It's going to be simple, tubular, coiled. And it's going to be the one that plays a role in thermoregulation. So the oil gland doesn't play any role in thermoregulation at all. The secretion from the sebaceous gland, is called sebum, and the sebum is the oil that's secreted from the sebaceous gland. And the central cells of these alveoli, which is referring to the structure of these specific glands, they accumulate with lipids until they become engorged, and then they burst. So because they burst, they work via, or they're called holocrine glands. This is the mechanism of their release. So the whole buildup, everything within the secretory cells here, is then going to be released. So again, these are holocrine, and the others, the sweat glands, are going to be merocrine. So there is a secretion of the sebum into the hair follicle. Sometimes it could be a pore on the skin, but usually it's into the hair follicle. The erector pili, the goosebump muscle contractions, are going to force sebum out of the hair follicle, and the sebum is going to soften, and it's also going to lubricate the hair and the skin. So it also provides kind of a protective bacterial killing function. So and it's also going to be stimulated by androgens as well.